TopMedTalk.
And welcome to day 2 of Anesthesiology 2022 here in New Orleans, Louisiana. TopMedTalk is in the exhibit hall, which has been an amazing experience, buzzing like crazy. We are at booth 2245. If you're listening, come and stop by and see us. I'm Desiree Chappell. I'm your host of TopMedTalk this weekend, and I'm joined by my co-host, Professor Saul Aronson.
Hi, Desiree. How are you?
Great meeting so far. The interviews have been spectacular.
And we've gotten great feedback. People have spontaneously grabbed me in the street, in the halls, and said, what you do is really cool. So if you're watching, thank you. If you're not, please, or if you are, tell people who are
Share
not to watch. And where can they find us?
So the live stream is at live.topmedtalk.com. That's live.topmedtalk.com. That is the live stream. So if you're listening to this, go there. We're going to be podcasting until 1 p.m. Central Time. If you want to find more of the content, that is at topmedtalk.com. So all of the conversations that we've had throughout the day yesterday, today, and tomorrow will be on TopMedTalk. We're putting them out as we do them as quickly as we can. It's a little hard to keep up sometimes. But live.topmedtalk.com for the feed, topmedtalk.com for our previous conversations, for sure. Saul, we have had the topics of, lots of topics of interest that we've talked about over the last 24 hours or so. Some of your key highlights?
Well, we just finished a conversation with Lee, our ongoing continuous
Lee Fleischer, CMO of CMS.
Of the world as we know it. And it's always a pleasure to speak with him because he's a big thinker. But, yesterday we started with world outreach and, talked about monitoring the unmonitored and everything in between. So it's been a really interesting day.
Yeah, it has. Well, I'm so excited to introduce our next guest. This has been an interview coming for a very long time. I think 4 years ago is whenever we had our first conversation. But Dr. Jed Wolpow from Johns Hopkins. Jed, I'm so excited we could finally make this happen.
Me too, Desiree. Thanks so much for having me on, Sal. Really a pleasure to be here, and to sit in the seat right after Lee Fleischer is really an honor. It's been a lot of fun following your work over the past 4 years since we first met, and then finally making this happen. Yeah.
Well, what is so great is the fact that we have two groups of podcasters up here on the stage at the same time talking to each other. Jed, tell us a little bit about your background, and then specifically about the podcast that you run.
Yeah, so the podcast is called ACRAC. It stands for Anesthesia and Critical Care Reviews and Commentary. So I started off actually...
It sounds like an insurance commercial.
Yeah, it's a lot like Aflac. In fact, our first logo was designed by one of my residents back in 2016 when I started it, which was a take on the Aflac the concept. They designed a laryngoscope that looked like a beak.
Cute. Yeah, very cute.
We changed it since then, but that was a lot of fun. So I started off actually in emergency medicine, and this was back in 2013, 2014. And in emergency medicine, as you may know, there are an incredible number of podcasts, including some back then very popular ones that are still very popular, the most kind of significant of them being EM-RAP, Emergency Medicine Reviews and Perspectives. And that podcast was listened to by pretty much every resident in emergency medicine. It was just something that tied together the community across the country. Yeah. And so when I switched into anesthesiology, I went looking for the version of that in anesthesiology, and it didn't exist. Yeah. And so back then I was a resident, I didn't have time to do anything, but I had in my head this idea that, man, we really need something like MRAP, but we need it in anesthesiology. And then I finished my residency, and I went to Johns Hopkins to do my fellowship in critical care, and finished that, started getting involved in resident education, and my predecessor, the then program director, at some point randomly said to me, the residents keep asking for audio resources. Do you know about anything? And I said, I don't, but you know what? This is the impetus I need. So I said, I'm going to do this. I had no idea what I was doing or how to do it. And I just started recording stuff. Didn't know really how to put it. In fact, I didn't put it online at first. I emailed it out to my residents. Mm-hmm. And they said, this is great. You should put it online. I said, great. I have no idea how to do that.
Help.
So they helped me. Started a website. That was 2016. And it just grew. And we've been doing it now for 6 years and 230 some episodes. And it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
As the old guy, on the couch, if I may, it's just amazing, the father of 2 29-year-olds, how education, I want you to speak to this because I know you have a deep background in education science, has evolved so rapidly from the talking head, show up on time for the lecture or we'll lock the door and bar you from entering the room, to I want education when I want it, on my time, in my place and space. And it's so different, and it's so interesting how quickly it's evolved. Through the lens of an educator, speak to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at first when we started to see medical students not going to lecture because they were made available, the lectures were made available on audio recording, on video, there was a lot of consternation, right? I remember this. It was not, it didn't happen when I was a med student. It was slightly after that, but I remember people being kind of not knowing what to do about that. Is this a good thing? Is it not? Aren't we losing something? But what we found, I think, is that the students, and it's far beyond med students, it's ubiquitous now, but students, any learner, really values having control over their own time and learning, as you said. And part of that is very much in line with what we know about adult learning theory, that adult learners, and this is different than child learners, right? This is different than kids in elementary school. Adult learners need to have some control and input over their own learning. That's how they learn best. And so giving multiple options, and podcasts by no means are the only option, but one good option really gives a lot of control. And there was a great article in Academic Medicine about 2 years ago, I think, that was a qualitative study, and they looked at people, at residents and trainees in emergency medicine, and they really tried to elicit some themes. Why do people use podcasts? How do they use them? What are the pros and cons? And they found things that I think I knew from being involved in this, but maybe not everyone knows. One is that it really creates a sense of community. So everybody kind of gets on the same page, assuming everyone's listening to it. And then what it does is it empowers learners not only to get that learning, but then they feel more comfortable going to their attendings and asking the questions, because now they have the language. Mm-hmm. Now they know this question in their head is actually something that's being debated in the greater world of emergency medicine or whatever field it is. Whereas before they might think, oh, I don't know the answer to this, but man, I'm not going to ask because it's going to make me look like I don't know something I should. But if they hear the hosts talking about it and debating it and thinking, this is a good question, we need to find more out of it, then they're totally comfortable asking about it.
Interesting. It sort of democratizes the unknown known as well as the known.
Right.
And that's, develops a degree of freedom to be inquisitive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. I think it opens that. It gets rid of that imposter syndrome a little bit, where you don't feel like it's going to reveal something bad about you to ask a question. And it creates a sense of community. So anywhere you go, it could be a different program. It could be at a conference. You meet someone else who listens to that same podcast and you start talking about the topic that was on the last one, and so you have that connection that really fosters further learning when you start with a podcast, or it could be, of course, anything. It could be a video. It could be anything. And of course you can get that from a lecture, but the limitations to an in-person lecture are that only a certain number of people can be there at any given time, and that it's not a great way for adults to learn, right? Being lectured at for an hour, we know very clearly is not good. People do not retain that information well. I'm one who I really struggle to sit and listen for an hour.
My ADD kicks way
So
in.
the risk of being blasphemous, here we are at a convention where, the MO is didactic learning or sharing. What's the future of that mode and media?
That's a great question. I'll tell you what I think. First of all, there's been a lot of changes. The past, I don't know how many years our ASA folks could tell us, they now make these available online, right? So you can do the digital version, which means you can either not go to the conference, or after the conference you can revisit the talks, which you can do at your own pace, break them up, listen to it 1.5 speed, however you want to do it. So I think that's an innovation that's changed and brought this asynchronous approach to even conferences like this. But the other is that I think we have work to do. So some of the emergency medicine tends to be ahead on this for whatever reason, and you'll find some of their conferences now have gone down to, they've created rules where no talk, not even the keynote, can be more than 15, 20 minutes.
It's like TED Talk. Keep it a TED Talk.
Yep.
Minimal slides, pictures, not a lot of text.
Exactly.
There are a lot of conferences that are going to that.
I
we do that
appreciate
at
We do
EdPom.
that in EdPom as well. If you can't say it in 15 minutes, you sure as heck don't need 30.
Right. Well, the problem is it's much easier to do an hour, right? I mean, if I'm creating a talk, it's much easier. It's way easier. I can just throw everything in there. If you tell me I have to cut it down to 15 minutes, I have to put a lot of work into that. So we tend not to do it, but I think that's exactly right. You can put the high yield stuff in 15 minutes. And the other thing you can do, I read recently that I can't remember if it's Facebook or Amazon, I think it's Amazon, Jeff Bezos banned PowerPoints. So at all the meetings, there's no PowerPoints. Everybody, what you have to do is you send out a memo. It's flipped classroom. You send out a memo beforehand that summarizes the key points, and then the meeting is everybody talking about it.
I love it.
And that, to me, is what we should be doing, right? If you're going to give an hour, or you were going to give an hour-long talk at ASA, you should send out some sort of summary, and then have it be an interactive session. Let's debate it. Let's talk about it. Get audience input.
And you can still get all of the information out there. This is a really interesting topic. We talk a lot about it with our EBPOM organization, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. How do we create conferences where we still are able to disseminate information, which is easier for the presenter to do when you have an hour and you're getting it out there. What we have found is one, cutting that back a little bit, but also I think if you're going to do that, because you still have to have this out there, and it's a good forum when you have 10,000 people in the space to do that, is that you have to complement it with things like what we're doing right now. So here, I'm going to present this to you. Okay, let's get down and really talk to you, the presenter, not necessarily just everybody in the room. You do need that, but like, hey, Jed, let's really break this down. What were you talking about here? Or let's talk about this specific study.
Yep.
So I think that this is, this format is a really good complement to that, as well as like panel discussions are always great, because then, it's a win-win-win for everybody. Like, you are cutting down content, but you also are having a full discussion with, 3 key opinion leaders that are sitting on the stage versus just one.
Yep.
So, I love being able to talk when we're planning conferences and planning these types of things. It's like, let's add this piece into it.
I agree.
And then the fact that you put it on a podcast, one of the things that we commonly do on TopMedTalk is that we offer the lecture that we gave at EBPOM or whatever that lecture was, and then we put it right next to the conversation that we had about it. So now in podcast or video form, you can watch that and then have this piece to it too.
Right, and that's
that
so
people
valuable.
may not have heard that piece.
Right.
So
that's so valuable. I'll tell you, and I'm sure you guys get this too. I get these all the time. I got an email yesterday from a listener of my podcast in Iraq, and he did not, he's not coming to ASA, and he's not going to, lectures all over the United States, right? He uses what he can find online, my podcast and others, to study, and he wrote me to say that he had passed his anesthesiology boards, and he wanted to say thank you. Now, I told him it's not me, it's your hard work, right? But the point is that doing this not only helps, the person who maybe missed the talk here, but right, it helps people who can't possibly get this content.
Sure.
Well, and I think that's a cool anecdote and neat to hear things like that for sure. But it raises, I think, a really important other point, which is reach. Medical education is a complex science, and we're becoming more sophisticated about how to deliver it now than before when I was growing up, when I was your age. But the reach, it's a global audience now. And tell us about your reach and your podcast. I read over 5 million downloads in over 100 countries. Is that correct?
That's right. As hard as that is to believe.
I'm throwing you a curveball, man. Knock it out of here.
As hard as that is to believe, that's right. And I'll tell you, when I started this, as I said, I literally thought maybe some of the Johns Hopkins residents would listen to it. That was the extent of my vision. Right. And now, we have more than 50,000 unique monthly listeners, more than 5 million downloads in more than 100 countries around the world. And I get these emails from all over the world. So, it's absolutely... You could never have that kind of reach giving a talk at a conference live or even writing a journal article, right? You're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people over time who can access this, many of whom, especially outside the United States, would never have gotten it, right? And are able to learn anesthesiology or whatever field you're talking in a way they would not have been able to access. So it's a real privilege to be able to do this, I think, and feel like you're able to help people around the world.
And one of the things that we've experienced and has been key to our, the tactics of being successful is just continuously generating new, fresh content. Tell us about your process.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, people ask me a lot if I repeat episodes, and I never have. And they say, well, you can at this point, This American Life repeats.
Yeah.
But to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because you can get the old episode. Now, I have updated, right? So I gave a talk on, an initial talk on the use of sodium bicarbonate, and then after the Bicar ICU trial came out, I updated that session. But I think that it's important to try to continue. There's so many topics that you can cover in any one field. I don't think I'll ever run out. I'm sure you guys will never run out.
Never.
So what I do is when I started, I would just kind of think about a topic that I thought would be useful for my trainees or anyone else. And as it's evolved over time and we've had more and more listeners, I get a lot of people who write me and ask if I'd be interested in having them on to talk about something that they're interested in, something they're an expert at. And so that's one way. And I obviously can't say yes to everybody, but if those seem interesting, I'll often invite people to come on the show through that to talk about what they're an expert in. When we have people come to Johns Hopkins and give grand rounds, I often will reach out to them and say, would you like to come on the show? And then other interesting things. So, I haven't aired this one yet, so a little teaser out there, but Dr. Richard Harris, he goes by Harry, so Harry Harris, who was the anesthesiologist, if you remember back in 2018 when the Thai soccer team got stuck in that cave, he's the anesthesiologist from Australia who got them out. And so one of my residents happened to have his...
It's a fascinating story.
It's an unbelievable story.
It's an amazing story.
And one of my residents happened to have his email address, and I emailed him, and he came on the show, and we talked about how he thought through that, what that experience was like, how he decided what anesthetic to use for those boys. So, sometimes it's something like that comes around. But it's just, there's no end to the interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, that is so cool, Jed. So, as we're talking about, evolution of the podcast, because, when we first started it, it was so new. It was like there was you, us, not a ton.
Not a lot.
There are more. There's not a ton, really, but there are more. And we're like, oh, God, is anybody going to listen to podcast? Because when you first started, it was interesting, but especially because you were working a lot with trainees and younger generation. We were probably a little bit older, and people were really not into podcasts. Now everyone seems to be in podcasts. It's generation, doesn't matter. But now I'm kind of like, gosh, are people going to still listen? Like, that's what I'm always amazed. Like, they're still listening and they're still going to continue to listen. Like, what are your feelings on that, though? Do you feel like there's going to be an evolution of where we go?
I think podcasts will only get more popular. You're correct that I think even the older generation of folks out there are starting to come around, but there's still a lot of people who are still kind of novice to this. And every, from time to time, I'll get an email from someone who said, I've never listened to a podcast before, but my son told me I should or something like that. And then I listened and now, so I think that'll happen. And in terms of continuing to listen, what I find in my own podcast listening is that when I find a podcast I like, I tend to just become a loyal listener, and I put it in my podcast feed and I subscribe, and it just, it's almost like something bad has to happen for me to stop.
Yes.
And so I think that it's likely, and I would imagine, though I don't know that you've seen this in your numbers too, that they only go up because most people are going to keep listening, and then new people will come on board.
Yeah, it's the same for sure. How do you feel that different groups are going to continue to embrace using podcasts to educate and disseminate information and communicate with a broader audience? I feel like different organizations are. The ASA, both of us have a role here in the meeting this weekend. Tell me what you think about that.
I do. I think we're seeing that. So certainly within specialties, I mentioned emergency medicine kind of was at the forefront of this, and other specialties, ours, for example, is catching up, though there are something like 50 or 60 podcasts in emergency medicine on every little subspecialty topic
whatever
you can
think.
And we're not there yet. But I think that will happen. I've had residents who have been interested in starting, in fact, a couple who now are working on a pediatric intensive care focused podcast. I think there's room in cardiac, OB anesthesia, regional anesthesia. There are things, but there's over time I think we'll see focused podcasts start popping up in our specialty.
So that was a question: more focus or more consolidation, I guess. And I don't know what the answer to that question is. I wouldn't expect you to either. But this is a what do you think question. Is it good to slice or to glump?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I wouldn't combine. So let's say that there was a regional anesthesia, an OB anesthesia, and a cardiac anesthesia individual podcast. Right. You could bring them under one umbrella. And actually, Scott Weingart, who does the MCRIT podcast, Emergency Medicine Critical Care, he has kind of brought a few different folks under his umbrella of MCRIT, but they still have their own individual feed. Yeah. And I think that makes sense. I don't think that someone who's looking for OB content is going to be appreciative of having a bunch of regional and cardiac thrown into the same recording, right? So I think while you may see, and I've been approached by some folks, and I won't name names because nothing's official, but about potentially kind of creating an umbrella of high quality, clinical focused medical podcasts. And that's something I'd be interested in exploring, but I wouldn't give up the ACRAC feed because I think people come to that. They want that content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, just wrapping up here, Jed, tell us just a little bit about the specifics of your podcast. Like, what are you mainly focused on? and then where people can go to find it.
Yeah, so it's accrac.com, ACCRAC.com, available on every podcaster.
Every time you say that, I think of a little duck.
That's right. And it's why you'll remember it.
Yeah.
Right? So
it's a good brand.
That's right. So available on the website and anywhere you want to get it. It's audio only. I've been very adamant about keeping it audio only. And I have no problem with video podcasts, but I think that you lose the ability to listen while you're commuting or while you're out for a jog.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think my listeners value, and some of the literature would suggest, is that podcast listeners in general do value that flexibility of being able to do it while doing other things. Now, whether that takes away from the learning is a debate. Actually, we don't know the answer to that, but we and others are doing some studies to try to figure that out. But regardless, I think that we're audio only. We're available everywhere. And we focus about, I'd say it's probably about 2/3 anesthesia and 1/3 critical care. Mm-hmm. So you can get either one, and you can pick and choose. So if you're a medical trained intensivist, you don't want the anesthesia stuff, but you want to do the critical care stuff, you absolutely can. And we'll be covering ongoing topics. And every once in a while we do something fun like the Harry Harris. I mean, that was anesthesia, but more kind of really interesting, unusual stuff. And every once in a while, I did a book review about a book called The Obesity Code a few years ago that was just a fascinating book, so kind of did a book review on that. So every once in a while, we have stuff. Some is very focused towards trainees, so we do some oral board review.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. That it's that's why you have so many trainees listening. It really is a wonderful resource.
Yeah. I think they use it a lot to prepare for boards. We have what are called our keyword episodes, which are based on the ABA keywords to prepare for the board exams. But we have a lot of topics that are, I think, very helpful for anyone in practice. We've done some recently with Mike Asando at Ohio State on kind of how to care for interesting new cardiac patients, like patients with a non-wired or wire-free ACDs and defibrillators, total artificial hearts, VADs. If you're just a general practitioner and you see a patient with a total artificial heart, right, who's coming for a knee replacement, what do you need to know? Mm-hmm. And so we're offering CME now. And I think we're seeing a lot of people take that up because they really find this stuff useful.
Well, and that was going to be my last question is when everyone's searching for how do I get my CME, that I don't have to travel to do that. We all know the reasons for that. And, we've toyed with how do we create a pathway for that. What are some of the things that you're doing? Because, many people that I have found didn't realize that you can report podcast for CME and then CE in the nurse anesthesia world, nursing, you can use podcasts in that way. It's not always like the official Category 1 AMAs or our Class A credits in nurse anesthesia, but tell me a little bit.
Yeah, well, there's just a real fantastic thinker and innovator named Brian Cohen who started a company called CMEify, and we've partnered so that through his company, CMEify, we're able to offer Category 1 credit. Now, we aren't yet able to offer the nurse anesthesia credit, though we do have a lot of nurse anesthetists who listen, both students and practicing CRNAs, and so that's something I'd love to be able to do. But at the moment, we can only offer the Category 1 credit, but we are able to offer it. And so it is, you're right, podcasts do count. So what happens is you listen to the podcast, which is like going to a lecture, and then just as after a lecture, you would fill out a kind of evaluation form. You go on the CME, you click on the link through my website, but you get to CMEify, and then you fill out a little reflection on what you learned, and then you get the credit for it. So it's a really straightforward way, and you pay a small amount, but it's a lot less than going to a CME conference.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, Jen, it has been such a pleasure. Like I said, I'm so glad we made this happen. I just admire your work and thank you for your contribution to the field of anesthesiology. It really has made an impact. I talk to people across the world that listen to ACRAC and say how it has enhanced their practice. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. And I would just say the same back to you too, and Monty, that your work is fantastic. I listen. People, of course, all over the world listen. It's really fun to be able to talk to a fellow podcaster in the field, and you're doing great work.
We have not been commiserating
yet.
Not officially.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can catch up again soon.
Sounds
great. Again, accrac.com.
Accrac.com.
That's right. And any of your favorite podcasters. TopMedTalk, same. TopMedTalk.com. And your favorite podcaster. Please do, if you liked anything that you heard today, share with friends on Twitter. We're on all social media. Jet is as well. And we will be back in just a moment. Thanks so much for listening.
Bye.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.